When I bought my house, I never imagined that my biggest problem wouldn't be property taxes, maintenance costs, or even annoying neighbors. No, my biggest problem turned out to be a petty, power-hungry woman named Karen, who had somehow convinced herself that my property was hers to control. It all started a few months after I moved in. I live on a private lot with a long driveway separate from the main road. Since I wasn't part of the homeowners association, I assumed I wouldn't have to deal with any of their ridiculous rules. I was wrong. Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, had other plans. Karen decides my driveway is public property. At first, it was just a minor annoyance. I started noticing that random people were using my driveway to turn around or park for a few minutes. No big deal. But then I started seeing HOA members using it as a shortcut. My driveway connects two main streets, meaning people who didn't feel like driving around a block were cutting through my private property to save a few minutes. And who was leading the charge? Karen. One day I walked outside to see her car parked halfway down my driveway, and two other HOA members were blocking the entrance while chatting with each other like they were in a public park. I approached and said, "Hey, this is private property. You can't park here." Karen, without missing a beat, flipped her hair and laughed. "Oh, don't be ridiculous. Everyone in the HOA uses this driveway. It's practically public property at this point." I stared at her. "No, it's my property. You can't just decide it belongs to you." Karen smirked. "Well, actually, the HOA has an easement agreement with the city for accessible roadways, so technically we can use it." That was a complete lie. I went inside, pulled out my property documents, and confirmed that there was no easement, no shared ownership, nothing. My driveway was 100% mine. That's when I knew Karen had to be stopped. The final straw. Karen's OA pals make themselves at home. A few days later, I woke up to find 3 HOA members having a freaking picnic on my driveway. They had folding chairs, snacks, and were just sitting there, acting like this was a community park. I stormed outside. "What are you doing?" One of them had the audacity to say, "Oh, Karen said we could use this spot for our morning social." It's common property. I lost it. That was the day I decided, screw it, I'm shutting this driveway down. I block off my driveway, and Karen goes nuclear. That same afternoon, I went to the hardware store and bought heavy-duty steel poles, a chain, and a private property, no trespassing sign. I installed it all in one evening. The next morning, Karen showed up in her ridiculous SUV, fully expecting to cut through like always. But this time, she couldn't get through. The moment she saw the chains and signs, she slammed on her brakes in absolute disbelief. Then she did something that made me realize just how unhinged she was. She got out of her car, grabbed her phone, and called the police. Karen calls the cops and thinks they'll side with her. I watched from my porch as Karen dramatically paced back and forth, waving her arms like she was reporting a serious crime. When the cops arrived, she sprinted to them before they even got out of the car. "Officer, officer, this man is blocking a public road. He can't do that." I walked down calmly, already holding my property documents. The officer looked at Karen. "Ma'am, calm down. Can you explain what's happening?" Karen pointed at me, looking furious. "He installed an illegal barricade on HOA property." I handed the officer my property deed. "This is private property. I own the driveway. There's no easement. She's trespassing." The officer looked at the paperwork. Then he looked at Karen. And I swear, I saw the exact moment he realized she was insane. "Ma'am, this driveway isn't public. It belongs to him." Karen's jaw dropped. "What? That's not possible. Everyone uses it." The officer nodded. "And now you're trespassing on it." Karen sputtered, like the reality of the situation was physically hurting her. Then, in typical Karen fashion, she tried to double down. "Karen demands I be arrested. The cops are not having it." "But he's blocking a road. It's against the law." The officer sighed. "Ma'am, it's his land. He can block it if he wants to. That's not fair." I smiled. "Actually, it's completely fair. You don't own my driveway, Karen. You never did." At that point, the officer had enough. Ma'am, if you continue trespassing, we're going to have to issue you a citation. That's when Karen did the dumbest thing she could have possibly done. She stormed toward my barricade, grabbed the chain, and ripped it down, right in front of the police. There was a moment of silence. Then, one of the officers reached for his handcuffs. Ma'am, turn around. You're under arrest for property destruction. Karen froze. What? No. He provoked me. You destroyed private property in front of law enforcement. You're under arrest. Hands behind your back. And just like that, Karen was cuffed and taken to the squad car. As they put her inside, she shrieked at me. You can't do this to me. I'll have you thrown out of this neighborhood. I just waved. Enjoy explaining this to the... Karen kicked the door as the police car drove away. I stood there, feeling pure satisfaction. But I had no idea that Karen was about to take things to a whole new level. Because after she got bailed out, she came back with a new plan. And this time, she was out for blood. For a brief moment, I thought it was over. Karen had been arrested right in front of me. She had screamed like a banshee, thrown a full-blown meltdown in the back of the squad car, and had been driven off to the station. But Karen was like a cockroach, impossible to get rid of. The next morning, I walked outside, coffee in hand, expecting to enjoy a peaceful, Karen-free day. But instead, I saw her car back in its usual spot, idling just outside my property. And Karen was sitting inside, watching me. I sighed. Oh, great. She's back. I considered ignoring her, but then she stepped out of her car, dressed like she was about to file a lawsuit against the entire universe. She stormed toward my driveway with a smug smirk on her face. Hope you're ready for what's coming, buddy. I raised an eyebrow. Didn't you get arrested yesterday? Karen crossed her arms and let out a fake laugh. Please, that was a misunderstanding. The charges were dropped. And now you're about to see what happens when you mess with the wrong woman. Karen unleashes her HOA attack dogs. About an hour later, I heard the sound of multiple cars pulling up in front of my house. I looked out the window, and there they were, 3 HOA board members stepping out of their overpriced SUVs like they were some kind of mafia enforcers. Karen led the charge, strutting up to my door like she owned the place. She knocked aggressively, like she was the police. I opened the door slowly, keeping my expression neutral. Yes, Karen smirked. We need to talk. Behind her, the HOA president, Greg, looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Greg sighed. Look, we just want to resolve this issue peacefully. Karen immediately cut in. The issue is that this man is illegally blocking a community access road. I blinked. You're still trying this nonsense? Karen, this is private property. I already proved that. One of the other board members, a nervous-looking guy, pulled out a folder. Actually, we have an official complaint here. The HOA has voted to fine you for obstructing neighborhood traffic. I snorted. You're fining me? I'm not even part of that. Karen grinned like a hyena. Oh, but you are. Karen tries to force me into the and it backfires immediately. I tilted my head. Excuse me. Karen held up a document with a dramatic flourish. Congratulations. The HOA has voted to incorporate your property into the association. You're now officially a member. I looked at Greg, expecting him to shut this down. But Greg just rubbed his temples. Karen, we can't do that. That's illegal. Karen's smile twitched. Well, we already voted. So it's done. I burst out laughing. You think you can just force me into the HOA? That's not how this works. Karen's eye twitched. You don't get a choice. Your land is now HOA regulated. That means you have to comply with our rules. I took the document from her hands and skimmed through it. Then I laughed even harder. Because Karen, in all her delusional arrogance, had completely misunderstood how HOA expansions worked. I turned to Greg. You guys actually voted on this. Greg looked exhausted. Karen held a meeting without informing most of the board. I found out this morning. I grinned. So let me get this straight. You tried to annex my property without my consent, using an illegal vote, and now you think I have to follow your rules. Karen nodded confidently. Yes. And if you refuse to comply, we will start issuing fines immediately. I held up the document and slowly ripped it in half. Karen gasped like I had just burned the Constitution. You can't do that. I smirked. Watch me. Karen loses her mind and tries to physically remove my barricade. Karen's face turned tomato red. She turned to the other board members. Do something. He's defying the HOA. Greg held up his hands. Karen, this isn't legal. You can't just take his land. Karen ignored him. Instead, she stomped over to my driveway, grabbed a wrench from her bag, and started undoing the bolts on my barricade. I'll fix this myself. I immediately took out my phone and started recording. Karen, if you touch my property again, I will sue you for trespassing and vandalism. Karen didn't care. She kept yanking at the bolts, muttering under her breath about OA authority and neighborhood harmony. Greg finally stepped in. Karen, stop it. No. She turned to him, looking genuinely offended. Why are you defending him? He's the criminal. Greg shook his head. No, you are. Karen froze. And then the cops pulled up again. Karen gets arrested for the second time in 48 hours. The same officer from yesterday stepped out of the car with a look of pure exhaustion. He saw Karen with a wrench, saw my destroyed barricade, and just sighed. Ma'am, what are you doing? Karen dropped the wrench like it was on fire. She pointed at me. He's breaking HOA laws. I'm just fixing it. The officer looked at Greg. Greg shook his head. She's lying. She's trespassing. Again. The officer sighed deeply. Then he turned to Karen. Ma'am, turn around. Karen's face drained of all color. What? No. This can't be happening again. The officer pulled out his cuffs. Ma'am, you're under arrest for destruction of private property. Karen screamed. I'm being persecuted. This is harassment. The officer was done. He cuffed her, read her rights, and stuffed her back into the squad car. Greg sighed. I think we need a new HOA board. I laughed. You think. But what I didn't know. Karen wasn't finished. Because after she got out of jail, she decided to sue me. And that was the dumbest mistake she had ever made. I should have known Karen wouldn't go down without one final, desperate attempt at revenge. After being arrested twice in 48 hours, most people would have taken the L and moved on. But not Karen. Instead, she decided to sue me. That's right. Karen filed a lawsuit against me for HOA violations, harassment, and emotional distress. She actually thought she could drag me into court and win. But what happened next was the greatest legal humiliation of her life. The lawsuit arrives, and I can't stop laughing. A few weeks after Karen's second arrest, I got a knock on my door. It was a process server holding a thick envelope. Are you my name? Yep. He handed me the papers. You've been served. I opened the envelope, skimmed through the legal jargon, and then I burst out laughing. Karen's lawsuit was the most ridiculous thing I had ever read. She was suing me for $50,000 in emotional damages for unjust HOA enforcement resistant, property obstruction violations, despite the fact that my driveway was mine, harassment and public shaming because I intentionally embarrassed her by recording her tantrums, loss of community respect, which was hilarious because everyone already hated her. She was literally suing me for not letting her trespass. I immediately called my lawyer, Lisa. Lisa read through the lawsuit twice. Then she chuckled. Oh, this is going to be fun. We take Karen to court, and she's a complete mess. A few weeks later, we went to court. Karen showed up acting like she was about to win millions. She had on a ridiculous power suit, her hair was styled like she was about to run for office, and she was smirking like a movie villain. Her lawyer looked miserable. I had a feeling he had realized too late that his client was insane. The judge walked in, looked at the case details, and I swear, he already looked annoyed. He sighed. All right, let's begin. Miss Karen, you are the plaintiff. Please state your case. Karen stood up dramatically, like she was about to give a TED Talk. Your Honor, I have been the victim of extreme harassment, targeted discrimination, and unlawful obstruction of community property. This man, this criminal, has caused me unbearable emotional distress. The judge raised an eyebrow. You're claiming emotional distress? Karen nodded aggressively. The judge flipped through her case file. Then he turned to me. Mr. My last name, are you a member of the HOA? I shook my head. No, Your Honor. My property was never part of it. The judge looked back at Karen. Miss Karen, you do realize that the HOA has no legal authority over properties not included in its contract, correct? Karen blinked. Well, we voted him in. The judge's face twitched. Miss Karen, you cannot just vote someone into an HOA without their consent. That is not how property law works. Karen looked completely caught off guard. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Then she switched tactics. But Your Honor, his driveway was being used by multiple residents. That means it became part of the community. He blocked a public road. The judge sighed. Then he turned to me. Do you have proof that your driveway is private property? I handed him my deed, my property map, and the previous police reports. He read through them for about 20 seconds. Then, without even looking up, he said, Miss Karen, you are trespassing on private property. This lawsuit is dismissed. Karen freaks out in the courtroom and gets fined instead. Karen stood up so fast her chair nearly flipped. What? No, this is wrong. He can't win. The judge banged his gavel. Ma'am, sit down. Karen ignored him. He's a menace. He can't just keep me out of his driveway. It's not fair. The judge leaned back, pinched his nose, and took a deep breath. Then he flipped through his notes again. Miss Karen, not only is your case dismissed, but I'm also issuing a counter ruling. Karen froze. What? The judge turned to me. Mr. My last name, would you like to countersue for damages? I grinned. Absolutely. Karen pays me $75,000 in damages. Lisa stood up. Your Honor, my client has suffered financial damages due to multiple incidents of property destruction, trespassing, and legal fees associated with defending himself against this frivolous lawsuit. We request full compensation. Karen's face turned ghost white. The judge nodded. Agreed. Miss Karen, you are ordered to pay Mr. My last name $75,000 in damages. Karen collapsed into her chair like a puppet with cut strings. She tried one last desperate plea. But I don't have that money. The judge shrugged. Then I suggest you figure something out. Court is adjourned. The gavel slammed. And just like that, Karen's nightmare became real. The aftermath, Karen loses everything. A few weeks later, I heard from one of the few neighbors who actually liked me that Karen was selling her house. She couldn't afford to pay the fine and keep up with her mortgage. The HOA? They completely abandoned her. Karen went from being the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA to a disgraced joke that everyone avoided. And me? I paved my driveway with fresh asphalt, built a stronger gate, and put up an even bigger sign that said private property, trespassers will be prosecuted. And every time I see a Karen-like neighbor glaring at my driveway, I just smile. Because now, they all know better.